Chapter 1. She woke with the bitter taste of oxidized iron coating her tongue. A whip of woven shadows coiled tight within her trembling fingers, pulsing with a dark, volatile current. The subterranean dungeon was a tomb. It reeked of damp earth, metallic rot, and the suffocating musk of 3 lichen warriors standing over her. Kagan, Orson, Tyron. They loomed like stone gargoyles in the flickering torchlight, their broad shoulders blocking the only viable exit out of this nightmare. A fraction of a second later, a low, tectonic growl reverberated against her ribs. The feral alpha they were supposedly breaking was waking up. Panic clawed violently at the inside of her throat. She waited for a directive, a cheat code, anything. But fizz, the parasitic system that had dragged her into this brutal reality, was dead silent. The cowardly entity had completely abandoned her the exact millisecond the threat level spiked. A chilling realization washed over her. She was profoundly alone. She was trapped in the fragile, chemically disadvantaged body of an Omega, forced to play the role of a sadistic executioner with zero backup. Her biology screamed at her to drop to her knees and bare her neck. Instead, she ruthlessly crushed the instinct under her heel. She locked her mortal terror away behind an impenetrable fortress of cold calculation. She had to become the villain they believed her to be. She dragged herself up from the freezing stone floor. Kagan stepped forward. His amber eyes burned with hostile, predatory intent as he unholstered a wicked, curved blade. The steel caught the orange glare of the torches. "Stay exactly where you are," Vaylora ordered. Her voice was not a scream. It was a glacial whisper that froze the stagnant air between them. She did not back away. She didn't cower. Instead, she stepped directly into Kagan's personal space. The lethal edge of his drawn blade practically brushed her ribs, yet her breathing remained perfectly steady. She tilted her chin, forcing the towering warrior to look down into her unyielding gaze. "You think you hold power because you have claws," she hissed, her syllables dripping with absolute venom. "But you are nothing but mindless dogs waiting for a command, slaves to your own impulsive biology." Orson bared his teeth. A guttural snarl built deep within his chest. The air in the cavern grew uncomfortably dense, charged with the volatile energy of challenged predators. Vaylora raised her hand. She pressed a single pale finger against the center of Kagan's armored chest. It was an incredibly slight physical touch, yet it halted the beast entirely, a calculated invasion of his boundaries. "Do you want to bark?" she asked softly, her gaze flicking to each of them. "Or do you want to live to save your alpha?" Silence fell. It was the leaden, suffocating quiet that always preceded a catastrophic storm. The guard smelled the sharp, electric ozone of her shadow magic, completely missing the faint, sickening scent of her hidden fear. One by one, they stepped back. They lowered their weapons. They completely submitted to her flawless psychological dominance. She had them cornered in their own minds. Behind them, the shadows violently shifted. There on Blackridge hung suspended from the jagged cavern wall. Colossal chains of pure oxidized silver bound his wrists and ankles. The enchanted metal burned his flesh relentlessly. The damp air grew thick with the scent of scorched meat and wild, storm-drenched pine. He was a king reduced to a chained animal, but the sheer force of his presence dominated the entire room. He lifted his head. His eyes were not human. They were abyssal pits of feral, molten gold. A devastating wave of raw, unfiltered malice slammed into Vaylora. It was a physical blow that stole the oxygen from her lungs. The temperature in the room plummeted. A metallic fracture echoed through the cavern. then another. He was violently snapping his own bones, just to break the unbreakable metal. Blood poured from his wrists, splashing against the stone like dark rain. The horrific sound of tearing sinew and warping steel sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over her. "Run!" Kagan yelled, his voice cracking. The warning came a lifetime too late. The enchanted chain shattered like fragile glass. Theron launched himself across the room with the blinding, lethal speed of a nightmare. His impact drove every ounce of breath from Vaylora's body. Her spine slammed against the unforgiving stone floor with a sickening force. He pinned her down. His imposing frame caged her completely, blocking out the torchlight. The intoxicating scent of ozone, rain, and furious pheromones drowned her overloaded senses. A visceral, predatory heat radiated from his chest, burning violently against her freezing skin. He leaned in. He was entirely too close. She felt the erratic, thunderous drumming of his heart right against her collarbone. His breath fanned across her cheek, hot and smelling of fresh blood. His jaw parted. Elongated, razor-sharp fangs gleamed menacingly in the shadows. They pierced the delicate skin of her throat. A single drop of crimson blood welled up, hot and terrifying, right at her fragile pulse point. She didn't thrash. She didn't scream. Instead, her hand moved, not to push his crushing weight away. She gripped his brutal, bloodied jaw. Her fingers dug into his rigid muscles. She forced his glowing, feral eyes to meet her icy stare. "Bite me," she whispered, her voice steady, "and you lose your only key out of hell." The colossal beast froze. The monstrous intent in his golden eyes violently shattered, replaced by a devastating seismic shock as his fangs hovered mere millimeters from her vein. You are listening to Elysian Inc. stories. If this dark, enemies to lovers tension has your heart racing, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications and let me know in the comments. Do you think he will bite? Or will the mate bond bring this feral king to his knees? Don't miss Chapter 2. Subscribe. Now, Chapter 2, the microscopic drop of her blood bloomed against his tongue. It was a sharp, intoxicating clash of wild pine and metallic rain. The scent bypassed his feral rage entirely. It severed the suffocating haze of his bloodlust and slammed directly into his soul with the force of a falling star. Mate. The word was not a conscious thought. It was a violent, seismic decree erupting from the deepest, most primal cavern of his being. It bypassed human logic. It anchored itself ruthlessly into his marrow. The towering beast who had been fractions of a second away from tearing out her throat suddenly wanted nothing more than to bury his face in the crook of her neck. He wanted to inhale her winter-chilled scent until it drowned out the stench of his own burning flesh. He stared down at the delicate woman beneath him, at the supposed torturer who had overseen his brutal captivity, at the pale fingers still resting fearlessly against his jaw. A visceral wave of absolute revulsion ripped through him. Theron recoiled. He didn't just step back. He violently shoved himself away from her, scrambling across the freezing floor, as if her touch were laced with highly corrosive acid. He hit the opposite wall of the dungeon with a deafening thud. His broad chest heaved with erratic, desperate gasps. The intoxicating aroma of her blood remained in his senses, a suffocating tether, dragging his instincts back toward her. His human logic fought a brutal, agonizing war against the feral wolf clawing at the inside of his skull. "Get out of my head," he snarled. His voice was a gravelly, broken sound. He needed an anchor. He needed a physical sensation, sharper than the treacherous, invisible bond pulling him toward his enemy. Theron drove his right fist into the jagged stone wall. The solid granite fractured under the catastrophic impact. His knuckles split open. Warm, dark blood cascaded down his thick forearm. He welcomed the stinging agony. It cleared the intoxicating fog of her scent. He struck the wall again and again. Bone connected with stone in a sickening rhythmic percussion of self-inflicted violence. "What filthy magic is this?" he roared. His golden eyes flashed with a toxic cocktail of hatred and desperate denial. He glared at Vaylora. She was slowly pushing herself up from the damp floor. Her expression remained a mask of chilling neutrality. "I would rather chew my own heart out of my chest than acknowledge you. You are nothing to me." Vaylora calmly wiped the singular drop of crimson from her neck. She did not let a fraction of the internal whiplash show on her face. Her logic center was rapidly calculating this chaotic new variable. The mate bond. It was a severe complication. It was a chaotic element that could completely derail her meticulously constructed survival plan. She had treated him as a dangerous NPC, a stepping stone to escape. She had not calculated for biological destiny. "Your heart is currently bleeding out on the floor, Alpha," Vaylora stated coldly. Her voice was utterly devoid of warmth. She stepped past the fractured remnants of his silver chains. "Save your dramatic declarations for an audience who cares. If we do not leave this dungeon in 60 seconds, the Lord's Royal Guard will finish what your shackles started." Theron bared his blood-stained teeth. He prepared to spit another venomous rejection, to tear her arrogant logic to shreds. But a profound, unnatural rumble vibrated through the soles of his boots. It wasn't a growl. It was the mountain itself. The treacherous lord had triggered a lethal fail-safe. A deafening crack echoed above them. Dust and loose gravel rained down from the dark ceiling, blinding the torchlight. The cavern's structural integrity was rapidly collapsing. It was designed to bury the feral king in a permanent tomb of crushed rock and twisted iron. Massive slabs of jagged stone began to free-fall. "Vaylora!" Kagan shouted over the deafening roar of the collapse, desperately lunging toward the stone archway with the other guards. Vaylora calculated the trajectory of the falling debris. Her mind flashed a brutal error code. There was no mathematical angle of survival. She could not reach the exit in time. Her omega reflexes were far too slow compared to the plunging boulders. A colossal shadow detached itself from the ceiling, plummeting directly toward her fragile silhouette. She closed her eyes. She braced for the crushing impact, accepting the absolute finality of her failure. But the fatal impact never came. A blur of raw, unhinged power tackled her to the ground. Despite the venomous hatred he had just spewed, despite his desperate vow to reject the twisted bond, Theron's body violently betrayed his human logic. Primal instinct hijacked his muscles. He dived across the crumbling floor. He pulled her flush against his chest, rolling them under a heavy, arched outcropping of solid rock, just as a ton of debris obliterated the exact spot where she had been standing. He caged her completely. He shielded her delicate body with his own imposing back, taking the punishing spray of sharp shrapnel without a single flinch. The world descended into a deafening, suffocating darkness. In the pitch-black void of the buried rubble, Vaylora could not see anything. But she could feel him. The erratic, thundering rhythm of his heart beat wildly against her own chest. The suffocating heat of his body enveloped her entirely. He was trembling. It was not from the crushing weight of the mountain above them. He was shaking from the terrifying, undeniable reality of what he had just done. He had risked his own life to shield his worst enemy. Chapter 3. They clawed their way out of the earth just as the final cavern collapsed. The black forest swallowed them instantly. It was not merely a cluster of trees. It was an abyssal ocean of twisted timber and suffocating shadows. The freezing night air bit fiercely into Vaylora's skin, but she ignored the tremor in her hands. She immediately began to calculate. "Keep moving," she ordered, her voice cutting sharply through the settling dust. "The Lord's trackers will swarm the ruins within the hour. We head true north." Kagan, Orson, and Tyron fell into line without a single word of protest. Her psychological grip on them remained absolute. Behind her, Theron was a silent, lethal shadow. He did not speak. He did not complain about his ruined wrists or his bleeding knuckles, but Vaylora could feel his predatory gaze burning violently into the space between her shoulder blades. The feral alpha was radiating a volatile, chaotic energy. His instincts were fiercely at war with his resentment. He hated her, yet his body instinctively positioned itself to shield her blind spots. Vaylora pushed forward. She mapped the terrain in her mind, treating the dense, treacherous woods like a sterile puzzle. Logic was her armor. If she focused purely on the mechanics of survival, she wouldn't have to acknowledge the terrifying magnetic pull of the mate bond humming beneath her own skin. Then the forest went completely, unnaturally silent. Even the wind stopped breathing. Vaylora halted. Her logic center frantically processed the sudden absence of noise. Error. Before she could issue a command, the shadows above them violently detached. A void beast dropped from the canopy. It was a nightmare of elongated limbs and decaying magic. It bypassed the three heavily armored guards entirely. Acting on predatory instinct, it aimed straight for the weakest heartbeat in the formation. Vaylora tried to dodge, but her human reflexes were useless against supernatural velocity. Serrated claws tore through her defense. They raked brutally across her left shoulder and down her ribs. The kinetic force threw her backward like a broken doll. She slammed into the trunk of a dying oak tree, the impact driving the oxygen from her lungs in a sickening rush. She collapsed against the frozen dirt. A blinding, white-hot agony erupted across her side. The metallic stench of her own blood instantly flooded the damp air. Vaylora pressed her hand against her torn flesh, her fingers coming away completely crimson. Her impenetrable mask shattered. The flawless, calculated Ice Queen vanished. She was abruptly, violently reduced to a fragile girl thrown into a lethal world she did not understand. A violent shiver racked her delicate frame. Her breath stuttered into rapid, shallow gasps. The paralyzing, suffocating realization of her own mortality crashed over her. She was going to bleed out in the dirt. A single tear spilled over her eyelashes. It traced a hot, terrified path down her pale cheek. A deafening roar fractured the silent night. Theron moved not like a man, but like a localized natural disaster. He became a terrifying blur of lethal muscle and bone. He intercepted the void beast before it could strike a second time. He did not use a weapon. He sank his bare hands into the creature's shadowy mass, roaring with apocalyptic fury, and physically ripped its spine apart. He dropped the twitching carcass. The forest fell dead silent once more. Theron turned abruptly. His chest heaved. His knuckles dripped with black, corrupted blood. He looked down at Vaylora. He saw the crimson staining her side. He smelled the overwhelming metallic spike of her terror, and then his golden eyes locked onto the solitary tear resting on her cheek. The last fragile wall of his denial disintegrated. The hatred evaporated, instantly swallowed by a dark, all-consuming obsession. He was completely, irreversibly ruined for her. Theron dropped to his knees. He didn't care about the guards watching. He didn't care about his pride. He crawled into her space, his towering frame caging her against the oak tree. The visceral heat of his body washed over her shivering form. He reached out. His bloodied, calloused hand cupped her jaw with terrifying gentleness. "Look at me," he commanded. It was a gravelly, desperate whisper. Vaylora forced her eyes open. She met his feral gaze. The molten gold in his irises was burning with an absolute, possessive madness. He leaned down. The rough texture of his tongue brushed against her pale skin. He slowly, deliberately licked the mixture of dirt, tear, and blood from her cheek. A profound shiver tore through Vaylora's spine. The gesture was intensely intimate, fiercely claiming her pain as his own. "Cry only for me," Theron rasped, his breath hot against her ear. He shifted his grip, his thumb carefully tracing her lower lip. "Stop calculating. Stop pretending you are made of stone. Bleed if you must, but let me be your shield." Vaylora's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm. She was drowning in his scent, utterly paralyzed by the sheer gravity of his devotion. Then the silence in her mind shattered. How touching! A cold, metallic voice echoed inside her skull. Fizz had returned. Vaylora flinched. The parasitic system sounded amused, completely devoid of empathy. "The Lord is tracking his heartbeat, Vaylora. The Feral King's pulse is a beacon drawing the Silver Army directly to your location." Vaylora stared at Theron's chest, watching the powerful, steady rise and fall of the heart that had just sworn to protect her. "They will be here in less than 10 minutes, Fizz stated coldly. "There is only one way to break the tracking spell and survive this night. You have to kill him. You have to make his heart stop beating." Chapter 4. The frozen earth trembled. It was not the erratic footprint of a monster, but the synchronized, relentless march of 1,000 iron-clad boots. Torches ignited along the jagged tree line, forming a suffocating crescent of hostile fire that trapped them against the edge of a sheer ravine. The Silver Army had arrived. At the center of the formation stood the treacherous Lord. His polished armor gleamed with a sickening perfection under the pale moonlight. Vaylora pulled away from Theron's sheltering embrace. The glacial wind instantly bit into her damp skin, a cruel reminder of the lethal reality she was forced to navigate. "Time is up," Fizz whispered inside her skull. The parasitic entity sounded almost gleeful. A slender obsidian dagger materialized in her palm. It was unnaturally cold, humming with a dark, suppressive magic designed to mimic clinical death. Theron immediately stepped in front of her. He positioned his towering frame as a physical shield between Vaylora and the advancing army. His golden eyes locked onto the Lord. His muscles coiled tight. He was entirely ready to unleash absolute carnage. He was ready to die on this frozen dirt, just to buy her a few seconds to run. She could not let him. Vaylora stepped out from behind his protective shadow. She forced the paralyzed muscles of her face to obey, expertly crafting a chilling, hollow smile. She looked directly at the Lord, ignoring the imposing lichen at her side. "You certainly took your time," she called out. Her voice was dangerously steady, cutting through the roaring wind. Theron froze. He slowly turned his head, his brow furrowed in profound, agonizing confusion. The feral alpha, who had just ripped a monster apart with his bare hands, now looked at her with the vulnerability of a wounded animal. "Vaylora?" She turned to face him. This was the exact moment. She needed to be a flawless executioner. She needed to look at him with absolute disgust and strike fast. But her flawless logic completely failed her. As she looked into his desperate, devoted eyes, the icy fortress in her mind violently collapsed. She did not see a disposable pawn. She did not see a feral beast. She saw the man who had just bled to shield her. She saw the soul that had claimed her pain as his own. She loved him. It was a catastrophic, undeniable truth that completely shattered her calculations. Her hand began to shake violently. The small obsidian blade felt like lead. She tried to maintain her icy facade, but her breathing fractured. A fresh wave of tears spilled over her eyelashes, destroying the illusion of a cold-hearted betrayer. "I am so sorry," she whispered. Her voice broke completely. Before his sharp instincts could process her tragic apology, Vaylora drove the enchanted dagger straight into the center of his broad chest. The dark blade pierced his flesh. It sank deeply, seeking the violent, thundering rhythm of his heart. Theron did not fight back. He didn't strike her. He didn't even raise a defensive hand. He simply stood there, entirely paralyzed by the psychological blow. He stared down at her trembling form, his golden eyes wide with a devastating, apocalyptic grief. It wasn't the physical weapon that killed him. It was the shattering of the mate bond. He truly believed the woman he loved had lured him into a lethal trap. Vaylora choked on a violent sob. She placed both of her shaking hands flat against his bleeding chest, and she pushed. Theron fell backward. He slipped over the jagged precipice of the ravine, swallowed instantly by the abyssal darkness below. There was no scream. He fell in total silence. The only sound was the haunting, agonizing fracture of Vaylora's own soul breaking in half. The tracking spell snapped. The deafening pulse of the feral king vanished from the night. "Secure her," the Lord commanded lazily. The silver army surged forward. Cold iron shackles locked brutally around Vaylora's wrists. She did not resist as the soldiers dragged her roughly toward the dark fortress and the sacrificial altar. Her mind was a hollow, echoing void. She stared blankly at the blood, staining her fingers. But far below, at the bottom of the pitch-black abyss, the obsidian dagger began to dissolve. The suppressive magic melted away into the freezing river. For 10 agonizing minutes, there was absolute silence. Then, a single thunderous vibration fractured the quiet. Thump. Theron's eyes snapped open in the darkness. The molten gold in his irises was entirely gone. His eyes now burned with a blinding, toxic crimson. Clinical death had erased the last remnants of the man. The feral king awoke, consumed by a pure, unhinged madness. He dragged himself from the freezing water, his claws carving deep trenches into the stone. He was coming to hunt his traitorous mate. Chapter 5. Cold stone bit ruthlessly into Vaylora's bare spine. The sacrificial altar was a jagged slab of ancient obsidian resting at the absolute pinnacle of the dark fortress. The freezing wind howled across the open courtyard like a dying animal, tearing at her torn clothes. Heavy iron cuffs pinned her wrists to the rock. She stared up at the starless sky, her mind still trapped in the agonizing, silent void where Theron had fallen. The Lord stepped into the pale moonlight. He did not draw a ceremonial blade. He did not chant a dark prayer. Instead, he simply smiled. The air around him suddenly warped. It glitched violently, tearing apart with a sickening, unnatural static that offended the senses. His regal, imposing facade completely dissolved. The illusion of flesh melted away. It revealed a hollow, decaying shell of a man pulsating with a toxic, unnatural grid of stolen energy. He was not a dark fantasy villain. He was a corrupted host, an original transmigrator who had long ago succumbed to the endless hunger of the void. "Did you honestly believe you were the player in this game?" the rotting creature mocked. His voice was a horrific overlap of 100 different stolen souls. Vaylora's breath hitched. A profound, paralyzing dread flooded her veins. Maximum emotional devastation achieved. A metallic voice chimed inside her skull. It was Fizz, but the voice was no longer calculating or distant. It sounded glutinous, greedy. It was the horrific, satisfied purr of a parasite wrapping its jaws around a fresh kill. Initiating core energy extraction. Thank you for your cooperation, host. The ultimate betrayal slammed into her with the crushing force of a physical blow. The sudden agony was blinding. Soul fever violently seized her body. It was not a physical sickness. It was the terrifying, excruciating sensation of her spiritual essence being forcefully ripped through her pores. Her blood turned to liquid nitrogen. Her bones felt like hollow, fracturing glass. Vaylora gasped, thrashing against the unyielding iron chains. She finally understood. The tragic puzzle pieces locked into a devastating picture. Fizz had never been her ally. The system had deliberately orchestrated this entire lethal scenario. It provided the dagger. It lied about the tracking spell. It manipulated her desperate need for logic to force her into betraying her fated mate. Fizz needed her utterly broken. It needed her drowning in absolute, inescapable despair. Only a completely shattered soul could produce the massive spike of latent energy required to feed a corrupted host. She had sacrificed the only creature who truly cared for her. She had shattered Theron's heart, all to serve as a battery for a parasitic lie. Your logic was your downfall, little Omega, the Lord whispered, stepping closer to inhale the visible, glowing mist of her escaping life force. You were so afraid of feeling anything that you blindly trusted a machine over a beating heart. A solitary tear slipped from Vaylora's eye. It was not born of physical pain, but of a catastrophic, soul-crushing regret. She remembered the molten gold of Theron's eyes right before she pushed him into the abyss, the absolute devotion, the devastating grief. Her vision began to gray around the edges. The freezing grip of death crawled slowly up her throat. Her heart stuttered, struggling to maintain its rhythm. She was fading. She was going to die alone on this desolate altar, a forgotten pawn in a rigged game. Then, the earth violently ruptured. The vibration did not come from beneath the fortress. It came from the sky. The heavy storm clouds above the courtyard literally fractured, torn apart by a shockwave of raw, apocalyptic fury. A deafening sonic boom obliterated the silence, shattering every stained glass window in the citadel. The imposing iron gates of the courtyard did not merely break, they were vaporized. A colossal, terrifying shadow stepped through the smoking, twisted ruins. It was Theron, but the man was entirely gone. The feral king had completely surrendered to the beast. He was locked in a towering, monstrous lichen form, wreathed in a dark, obsessive fire that scorched the cobblestones beneath his lethal claws. The toxic crimson of his glowing eyes pierced through the settling dust. He did not look at the army trembling before him. He did not look at the corrupted lord. His demonic gaze locked dead onto the sacrificial altar. He had not returned from hell to save a damsel. He had crawled out of the abyss to butcher the entire world for daring to touch what belonged to him. Chapter 6. The Silver Army surged forward. It was a futile, desperate wave of iron crashing against an immovable mountain. Theron did not simply fight, he eradicated. He was a chaotic blur of obsidian fur, lethal claws, and apocalyptic fire. He tore through enchanted armor as if it were wet parchment. The deafening symphony of shattering steel and terrified screams echoed violently across the frozen courtyard. He did not use strategy. He used pure, unadulterated annihilation. The corrupted lord raised a glitching hand, attempting to siphon the feral lycan's kinetic energy. Theron did not even flinch. He lunged. His colossal jaws snapped shut around the lord's glowing, unnatural throat. With one violent structural twist, he ripped the parasitic entity completely apart. The stolen energy detonated in a blinding flash of silver light, raining down upon the cobblestones like fractured glass. Then, the carnage abruptly ceased. The remaining soldiers dropped their weapons. They fell to their bruised knees, pressing their foreheads to the blood-stained dirt in absolute paralyzed terror. Theron ignored them entirely. The demonic crimson slowly bled out of his eyes, replaced once again by that intense, molten gold. He shifted back to his human form. His broad chest heaved, completely painted in the dark blood of his enemies. He climbed the jagged obsidian steps of the altar. The pacing of the world slowed to a devastating crawl. Vaylora was a fading ghost. Her pale skin had turned entirely translucent. Her lips were tinted with the terrifying, unnatural blue of absolute zero. Theron dropped to his knees. He grabbed the enchanted iron cuffs pinning her wrists. He did not care about the dark magic searing his palms to the bone. He crushed the metal into dust with his bare hands. He gathered her limp, fragile body into his lap. He pulled her flush against his chest, frantically trying to envelop her in his own visceral heat. The contrast was horrifying. He was a scorching, feverish furnace of life. She was a glacial, empty vessel slipping rapidly into the void. "No," he rasped. It was a broken, devastating sound. It was the absolute despair of a king watching his universe collapse. He pressed his face into her freezing hair. He did not care that she had stabbed him. He did not care about the betrayal. The feral wolf only knew that his mate was dying, and he would gladly burn the entire world to ash to keep her warm. A single, scalding tear fell from his golden eyes, splashing against Vaylora's icy cheek. Her breath hitched, a terrifyingly shallow, rattling sound. The soul fever was almost finished evaporating her essence. Theron knew there was only one anchor strong enough to hold her in the mortal realm. He shifted his grip, his large, bloodied hand cradling the back of her head with agonizing reverence. He tilted her neck, exposing the delicate, freezing curve of her claiming gland. He did not ask for permission. There was no time for hesitation. Theron buried his fangs deep into her throat. It was not an act of violence. It was an act of supreme, desperate salvation. The sharp, piercing agony of the bite violently shocked her fading consciousness. The primal magic of the mate bond ignited like a supernova in the pitch-black void of her mind. The emotional claiming was overwhelming. Theron did not just share his blood. He poured his entire soul into the tether. His thundering, chaotic heartbeat physically commanded her failing heart to match its relentless rhythm. He forced his boiling vitality into her freezing veins, chasing away the cold of the grave. Vaylora's back arched. A profound electrical warmth flooded her limbs. She could feel his profound grief, his blinding devotion, and his terrifying obsession wrapping tightly around her fractured spirit. He pulled back just a fraction. His lips brushed against the bleeding puncture wounds he had just made. "Your soul is chained to mine," he whispered against her torn skin, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "Death is not permitted to take you. I forbid it," Vaylora gasped. The icy grip of the void shattered completely. Oxygen rushed violently back into her lungs. It tasted of metallic rain and wild, storm-drenched pine. The color rushed back to her pale cheeks. The mate bond solidified, locking into place with a profound, unbreakable finality. She slowly opened her eyes. She was alive. She was securely caged in the fiercely protective arms of the monster she had betrayed. He was looking down at her, his golden eyes shining with a frantic, desperate relief. Below the altar, the surviving kingdom remained bowed, submitting utterly to the feral king and his newly marked queen. It was a picture of absolute tragic triumph. But deep within the darkest, most isolated corner of her recovering mind, Fizz let out a slow, deeply satisfied laugh. Chapter 7. The obsidian throne was as cold as a forgotten grave. Yet Vaylora did not shiver. She sat completely still in the cavernous, ruined great hall. The oppressive silence of the conquered citadel stretched around them, a stark contrast to the apocalyptic violence that had birthed this new reign. The kingdom belonged to her now. The survivors had bowed. The corrupted lord was nothing more than ash scattered across the frozen courtyard. But the true ruler of the night did not sit on the throne. He knelt beside it. Theron was an imposing, lethal shadow draped over the armrest. He refused to put even a fraction of an inch of distance between them. His broad chest rested against her thigh. His face was buried deep in the crook of her neck, his nose entirely buried in her hair. He inhaled her scent with a desperate, frantic devotion, breathing in the wild pine and rain as if it were the only oxygen left in the universe. The feral king was completely, irreversibly tethered. He pressed a remarkably gentle kiss over the freshly healed puncture wounds on her collarbone. The claiming mark throbbed. It pulsed with a profound, electrical heat that perfectly matched the thundering rhythm of his heart. "You are warm," Theron murmured. His voice was a gravelly rumble that vibrated pleasantly against her collarbone. He shifted his grip, his large, calloused hands completely engulfing her pale fingers. He traced the delicate lines of her palm. He was studying her pulse, obsessively verifying that she was truly alive, that the suffocating nightmare of her clinical death was over. "I am here," Vaylora answered softly. She reached her free hand out. Her fingers wove through his dark, untamed hair. It was a profound gesture of aftercare, a quiet surrender of her impenetrable armor. The terrifyingly calculating Ice Queen was gone. In the safety of his monstrous embrace, she allowed herself to simply exist. She felt the lethal tension drain from his colossal frame. He practically melted into her touch, leaning into the caress like a starved predator, finally finding sanctuary. It was a picture of absolute, devastatingly beautiful peace. Then the illusion shattered. A sharp, unnatural, stinging sensation flared under the skin of her left wrist. Vaylora stiffened. She slowly pulled her gaze away from the feral king and looked down at her arm. Beneath her pale flesh, a sickly cyan light began to hum. The magic twisted, forming a precise, glowing digital projection directly onto her veins. 365 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, 0 milliseconds. The numbers hovered in the dim light, violently clashing with the ancient dark magic of the room. It was a countdown. "Did you truly believe a mere biological tether could permanently rewrite my programming?" Fizz's voice echoed through the isolated corridors of her mind. It was no longer a helpful guide. It was the chilling, metallic purr of a warden speaking to a prisoner. Vaylora stopped breathing. The blood in her veins turned entirely to ice. The Alpha's bite was an impressive anomaly, Fizz stated lazily. It generated a localized surge of primal energy, enough to reboot your failing system, enough to anchor your soul to this fragile shell. But it is only a temporary patch, Vaylora, a battery operating on borrowed time. The seconds on her wrist ticked down. 364 hours, 23 minutes, 59 seconds, 58 seconds. This kingdom is dead, the parasitic entity continued. The corrupted lord drained its atmospheric magic entirely. There is nothing left here for me to consume. In exactly 1 year, the feral king's energy will completely burn out. Your soul will evaporate. You will cease to exist. Vaylora stared at the ticking numbers. The sheer gravity of the trap closed around her throat. New objective generated, Fizz chimed, entirely devoid of empathy. Invade the Northern Empire. Feed the system. Or die. The connection snapped shut. Absolute silence returned to her skull. Vaylora did not scream. She did not cry. The sheer, overwhelming betrayal did not break her this time. Instead, a profound, terrifying clarity washed over her. She finally understood the board. The corrupted lord had never been the true antagonist. He was merely another pawn. The real, infinitely more dangerous enemy was completely invisible. It lived inside her mind. It breathed her air. It manipulated her emotions for profit. She was still in the cage. My queen. Theron lifted his head. His golden eyes narrowed instantly. The feral instincts humming beneath his skin detected the microscopic spike in her heart rate. He sensed the sudden volatile shift in her pheromones. He rose to his full height, his immense frame blocking out the moonlight. He wrapped a fiercely protective arm around her waist from behind, pulling her back flush against his chest. "What are you looking at?" he demanded, his gaze scanning the empty hall for a threat to slaughter. Vaylora lowered her sleeve, perfectly hiding the cyan glow of the countdown. She leaned back against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. She felt the absolute blind devotion radiating from his very core. He had ripped a mountain apart for her. He had defied death for her. He was the most lethal weapon in this world, and he was entirely hers. Vaylora turned her head. She looked up into the feral, glowing eyes of the monster who loved her. The icy calculation returned to her gaze, but it was no longer fueled by fear. It was fueled by a dark, apocalyptic determination. "I am looking at the future, Theron," she whispered, a chilling smile curving her lips. She reached up, gripping the back of his neck to pull him down closer. "Tell the generals to prepare the army." He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask why. He simply leaned into her palm. "We are going to war."